Welcome to a story that explores the collision between a world of brutal shadows and the unstoppable light of a child's heart. Before we step into this lion's den, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us bring these stories of transformation to life. And tell me in the comments, if your life was a fortress of secrets, would you have the courage to let a child hold the key? The estate of Quan Jim Jum did not feel like a residence. It felt like a tomb constructed of cold, Italian marble. Outside, men with obsidian eyes and scarred knuckles patrolled the perimeter. But inside, the silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. In the center of this frozen kingdom sat Jim Jum himself. Even bound to a custom wheelchair, he remained a figure of terrifying elegance. His black suit was tailored to a razor's edge. His jawline remained sharp enough to cut, and his almond-shaped eyes held a calm, tired weight that promised a shallow grave to anyone who dared offer him pity. In the underworld, he was a titan who ruled through a whisper and a sharp blade. But now, he was a man who couldn't even lift a silver spoon. Every high-priced specialist and hardened military medic had already quit, driven away by his animalistic growls and a pride that viewed every offered pill as a total surrender. He was a dragon without fire, waiting for the end in a dark suit that felt more like a burial shroud every day. He didn't know that the sterile stillness of his tomb was about to be shattered, not by a rival's bullet, but by the smallest, most unauthorized sound in the house, the soft footfalls of a girl in a bright red dress. The Jim Jum estate was not a home. It was a museum of frozen power, a tomb constructed of polished Italian marble where the air refused to circulate. Inside the silent halls, the only sound was the rhythmic, clinical hum of the air filtration system, a noise that underscored the absolute isolation of its master. Quan Jim Jum sat in his custom wheelchair, a throne of chrome and leather positioned before a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked a garden he could no longer walk through. He wore a black suit, tailored so perfectly it seemed to hold his frail frame together, his white dress shirt crisp against the pale, smooth texture of his skin. Though his body was bound to the chair, Jim Jum's presence remained a predatory force. His jawline was sharp and angular, set in a permanent grimace of defiance that warned the world to stay back. To the underworld, he was still a titan, but in the quiet of his study, he was a man who viewed every offer of help as a profound humiliation. He had built an empire on ruthless strength, and to be handled or tilted by a stranger was a fate worse than the accident that had severed his spine. The staffing agencies had long since stopped sending their best. Now they only sent the desperate. The latest was a retired military medic who had arrived boasting of nerves of steel. He lasted less than an hour. When he reached out to adjust Jim Jum's posture, a low, guttural growl vibrated from the boss's chest, a sound more animal than human. Jim Jum didn't need to speak. His eyes, calm but heavy with a tired, lethal weight, promised a shallow grave for anyone who dared to pity him. As the medic fled, Jim Jum returned to his silent vigil, a dragon guarding a horde of bitter pride, unaware that the walls of his fortress were about to be breached by the most unauthorized sound in the world. While Quan Jim Jum sat in his marble tower, Sheila Williams was fighting a war of minutes and desperation. Her alarm had shrieked at 4:15 a.m., but the phone call that followed was the sound that truly chilled her blood. Her childcare had fallen through at the last second, leaving her with no safety net and a shift that started in less than an hour. To be late at the Jim Jum estate was to be invisible. To be absent was to be replaced. With a heart hammered thin by anxiety, Sheila looked at 7-year-old Aniette, who was still in her pajamas, her tight curls a halo of morning chaos. She did the only thing a mother with no options could do. She bundled her daughter into the car, whispering prayers into the cold morning air as they approached the towering iron gates. The guards, trained to look for assassins rather than children, barely glanced at the back seat as she swiped her badge. Sheila led Aniette toward the subterranean world of the mansion's utility wing, a place that smelled of bleach and steam. In the laundry room, a labyrinth of humming dryers and towering shelves of white linens, Sheila knelt and took Aniette's warm face in her hands. The contrast was startling. Sheila's eyes were wide with terror, while Aniette, in her bright red dress, looked back with nothing but curiosity. "Aniette, listen to Mommy," Sheila whispered, her voice cracking. This is the quiet game. You stay here behind these towels. You do not run and you do not make a sound. If the men in the suits hear you, the game is over. She tucked her daughter into a nest of freshly dried towels, leaving her with a picture book and a heavy sense of dread. As she closed the door, the click of the latch sounded like a final warning. The silence of the estate was no longer a burden, but the only thing keeping her daughter safe. The quiet game was a concept that struggled against the gravity of a 7-year-old's curiosity. For a while, Aniette sat in her nest of towels, watching the dust motes dance in the sterile hum of the laundry room. But the subterranean world was built for machines, not for a girl whose world was composed of questions. To Aniette, the heavy, airless silence of the floors above didn't feel like a warning. It smelled like the way her mother looked when she cried. A thick, gray saltiness that she had come to associate with a deep, unspoken sadness. She didn't mean to break the rules. She simply followed the scent of that sorrow, hoping to find its source and perhaps offer a cure. She slipped out of the laundry room, her small feet silent on the cold stone. In her bright red dress, she was a spark of impossible color moving through the gloom like a stray petal caught in a draft. Aniette drifted past the industrial kitchens and moved toward the long, shadowed hallway of the forbidden East Wing. The guards were at their posts, but they were trained to look for assassins at eye level, not a child moving with the fluid, accidental grace of a kitten. She reached the mahogany doors of the private study, the nerve center of the dragon's lair. The heavy doors had not quite caught the latch, and with a soft, determined shove, she pushed her way inside. There, framed by the cold light of the window, sat the man in the shiny chair, his profile as sharp and unyielding as a blade, unaware that the stillness of his tomb had finally been shattered. Quan Jim Jum did not turn his head as the heavy doors creaked open. He remained a statue of sharp jawlines and tailored black silk, staring at the gray autumn light. He had spent the morning preparing a verbal venom for the next nurse, but he had no weapons against the small, brown child in the bright red dress who now stood beside his chrome wheel. Aniette did not see the feared dragon of the underworld. She saw a man in a very shiny chair who looked like he had forgotten how to smile. "Is it a car?" she whispered, her voice a bell-like chime that fractured the room's tomb-like silence. Jim Jum's throat moved, a low growl dying before it could reach his lips because, for the first time in 2 years, he was looking at someone who wasn't afraid of him. Aniette ignored his stony mask and reached for the silver spoon resting on the tray of cold abalone porridge. To Jim Jum, being fed was the ultimate humiliation, a sign of surrender he had fought with animalistic fury. But Aniette didn't smell of medicine. She smelled of vanilla oil and the warm dust of the laundry room. "Open up," she commanded with the gravity of a queen. She lifted the spoon, but instead of a clinical gesture, she made a low, whistling sound. "Vroom vroom. It's an airplane, Mr. King. It needs to land in the cave." The absurdity of the moment hit Jim Jum like a physical blow. He looked at her earnest face, her tongue poking out in concentration as she balanced the porridge. Slowly, painfully, his locked jaw relaxed. As the plane finally landed and the first bite took hold, the terrifying dragon of soul felt a single, hot tear prick his eye, his pride finally lying in pieces on the polished marble floor. The warmth of the study was a lie that vanished the moment Sheila stepped through the heavy mahogany doors. She had been frantic, searching every corridor of the East Wing for the splash of red that had slipped through her fingers. But the scene she found stopped the air in her lungs. There was Aniette, perched beside the dragon's wheelchair, giggling as she guided a silver spoon toward the mouth of the most dangerous man in South Korea. Jim Jum did not look like a monster in that moment. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe and was just now relearning. But as Sheila rushed forward to scoop Aniette into her arms, her hip caught the edge of a heavy lacquer cabinet. The impact jarred a hidden latch, and a drawer slid open with a smooth, mechanical hiss. Inside, resting on velvet the color of dried blood, lay a pair of custom-made semi-automatic pistols, their grips worn smooth by a decade of violence. Beside them were grainy surveillance photos of men Sheila recognized from the evening news, men who had crossed the dragon and subsequently vanished. The realization hit Sheila like a physical blow, turning her blood to ice. This wasn't just a wealthy man in a shiny chair. This was the architect of the city's nightmares. She was standing in a room with a predator who had perfected the art of the end. "Aniette, we're leaving. Now," Sheila gasped, her voice thin and jagged as she gripped her daughter so tightly the girl let out a small whimper of protest. Sheila backed toward the door, her eyes darting from the cold steel in the drawer to the man in the chair, waiting for the monster to wake and silence the woman who had finally seen too much. The following morning, the atmosphere in the East Wing shifted from the sterile silence of a tomb to the charged electricity of a war room. 3 of Jim Jum's top captains, men with scars hidden under silk and eyes that had seen the collapse of rival empires, marched into the study. They had heard whispers of the dragon's softening, rumors that his hunger strike had broken not by force, but by the whim of a child. They came expecting to find a leader who had finally withered, a king they could justify as replacing. Jim Jum sat in his usual position by the window, but the air around him felt different. He was dressed in a $5,000 charcoal suit, yet there was a jarring, brilliant anomaly pinned to his lapel. A bright yellow sunflower sticker, a gift Aniette had pressed there with a sticky thumb before her mother whisked her away. To the captains, it was an insult, a sign of senility. The eldest, a man named Park with a voice like grinding gravel, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the cheap adhesive. "Boss," he began, his tone dancing on the edge of disrespect, "we are concerned that the foundation of this house is growing soft." Jim Jum did not growl. He did not snap. Instead, he slowly turned his head, his almond-shaped eyes holding a terrifying, crystalline clarity that stopped Park's breath. He looked down at the sunflower, then back at his men. "You think this is a weakness," Jim Jum said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried the weight of a death sentence. "But for the first time in years, I have something to protect that isn't just a pile of stone and blood. A man with nothing to lose is dangerous, but a man with a reason to live is a god." He leaned forward, the sunflower sticker glowing like a badge of office. In that moment, the captains realized the dragon hadn't lost his teeth. He had simply found a new reason to bite. The vulnerability wasn't a crack in his armor. It was the edge of a new, sharper blade. The transition between the night watch and the morning guard was the only moment the Jim Jum estate breathed. A 10-minute window where the ironclad discipline of the security detail softened just enough to be fatal. It was during this lull that the rival faction from the north, men who had been watching the fortress like vultures circling a dying king, saw their opening. They didn't come for the ledger or the vault. They came for the leverage they had seen through long-range lenses, a splash of bright red in a sea of gray marble. Aniette had slipped away from the laundry room again, drawn toward the garden fountain by the promise of a rainbow caught in the spray. She was laughing, her small hands reaching for the shimmering water, oblivious to the black van that had breached the perimeter gate during the guard rotation. Sheila was deep in the bowels of the house, distracted by a mountain of linens, while the dragon sat in his study, unaware that his new reason for living was seconds away from being extinguished. The strike was surgical and silent. 2 men in tactical gear emerged from the shadows of the hedges, their movements professional and cold. Before Aniette could even let out a cry, a heavy hand muffled her voice and she was hoisted into the air, her bright red dress fluttering like a captured bird. By the time the alarm finally wailed through the corridors, the van was already screaming toward the highway. Jim Jum heard the sound from his wheelchair. A jagged, high-pitched scream from the courtyard that wasn't an alarm, but Sheila's voice. He looked out the window just in time to see the tail lights of the vehicle vanishing into the morning mist. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the siren. The dragon's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning a ghostly white. The window of transition had closed, and in its wake, the frozen peace of the estate had been replaced by a cold, calculating fury that the underworld hadn't seen in a decade. The silence that followed Sheila's scream was not the silence of a victim, but the stillness of a predator calculating the physics of a kill. Jim Jum did not waste breath on a panic he could not physically act upon. Instead, he spun his wheelchair with a violent, controlled grace toward the bank of monitors in his private study. His fingers, once used to pull triggers and sign death warrants, now they were not willing to feed the injured Korean Mafia boss, until a 7-year-old girl walked in, aired over a custom ultra-slim keyboard. The dragon was no longer a man of stone. He was a ghost in the machine, a digital wraith with the keys to every kingdom in the city. He didn't need to leave his chair to burn the world down. With a series of rhythmic staccato keystrokes, he bypassed the firewalls of the Northern Syndicate's shell companies. He watched the scrolling green code reflect in his dark, tired eyes, the same eyes that had once promised a shallow grave, now promising financial annihilation. In the span of 6 minutes, he didn't just find the location of the van. He erased the kidnappers' identities. He froze their offshore accounts, liquidated their real estate holdings, and leaked their high-level police payrolls to the Internal Affairs Division. He systematically dismantled the lives of the men who had taken Aniette, turning their power into ash before they even reached their safe house. As he worked, the sunflower sticker remained pinned to his lapel, a bright yellow beacon against his black suit. For the first time in his life, Jim Jum wasn't fighting for territory or respect. He was fighting to reclaim the only soul he had left. Every line of code was a strike, every decrypted password a broken bone. By the time he sent the final command to lock the kidnappers inside their own high-tech warehouse, Jim Jum realized that his mind was a far more lethal weapon than his body had ever been. He had found his fire again, not to destroy, but to bring a girl in a red dress back home. The industrial hum of the Jim Jum estate had finally been replaced by a sound that once seemed impossible within its marble walls. The rhythmic clinking of plastic teacups and the bright, unabashed laughter of a child. The dragon's fortress had been breached, but not by the violence of the North. It had been conquered by the persistent, joyful presence of Aniette Williams. The high-security garden, once a perimeter for guards with cold eyes, was now a sanctuary of sprawling blankets and half-eaten oatmeal cookies. Quan Jim Jum sat in his wheelchair, but the stiff, tailored armor of his black suits had been traded for a soft linen shirt of pale blue. Pinned to his lapel was no longer just the sunflower, but a collection of pink butterfly stickers and a glittery star that Aniette had dubbed his general's badge. He watched her pour imaginary tea into a miniature cup with the same focused intensity he had once used to map out syndicate takeovers. When she handed him a cookie, broken in half because kings get the biggest piece, he didn't hesitate. He took it with a hand that had regained a hint of its former steadiness. His pride no longer a barrier but a distant memory of a man he no longer recognized. As Aniette told a sprawling, nonsensical story about a brave rabbit, a sound began to vibrate in Jim Jum's chest. It was low at first, a rusty friction against years of silence, before it broke free into a genuine, rolling laugh. It was his tea party roar, a sound that echoed off the stone walls and rose into the summer air, carrying the weight of his old life away.